Thank you all for coming to the third lecture, Thoughts and Things. So this lecture will be about indexicality, reference, and representation. The advertised title was Indexicality, and I'll say a little bit about that, but I've said quite a lot about indexicality now, and I'm going to move on a bit in this lecture. So I'll start with a bit of indexicality, and I'll talk about reference and representation as an issue. I'll start talking about success semantics, decoupled representations, decomposing representation. I'll say a bit about exploration and reference switching. So last week, just to run over what I got to at the end, and then I had to rush through. My main arguments were concepts are generally name-like. We open a file, it refers to the same thing all through its life. It doesn't shift reference from occasion to occasion. Indexicality in that sense, referring items that shift reference, feature only in a very specific area of cognition, in the thoughts that instruct the motor and speech systems. That's where I wanted to get to. And then I didn't say very much about the last bit, about how that works, and there's lots to say there. When I say that indexicality and such indexicals only feature in instructing the motor and speech systems, I didn't mean to say that they don't also feature in conscious personal level thoughts. I introduced the idea that we need these indexicals by saying when we come to act, I had the example, I want to read the last bit of Naming Necessity, and I'm in a room, and I think, that book here now, that's not Naming a Necessity, that's Naming a Necessity here now, and then that's the occasion for me to act. But we might well need some process of cognitive inference, conceptual inference, in order to arrive at the conclusion that naming a necessity is here now in front of me. I mean, I might reason it's a blue book. I've only got 2 blue books. The other blue book is in the kitchen, so this blue book must be naming necessity. Naming necessity is here now. So these essential indexicals do appear in conscious deliberate thought. There's lots of issues that I'm not going to be able to talk about how the essential indexicals interact with conscious thought. Adriana asked last week about how does the I now thought, it's in front of me now, relate to my permanent I file, and I've been thinking about that, and I haven't got very much to say. François and I were just talking about it a moment ago, and it's not quite clear what's the connection between these I now thoughts and this permanent repository of information that I have about myself. Interesting question. I'm still thinking about it. Some people think there's a problem in understanding how conceptual thought interfaces with the motor system. Corrado Sanaglia, Stephen Butterfield worry about the interface problem. Well, there are things to say here, but there can't really be a puzzle here. It's not puzzling. I mean, one thing we can take as given from the start is that there is going to be an interface between deliberate conceptual thought and motor instructions. After all, the whole point of having conceptual thought, the whole reason for us having evolved the ability to deliberate, to think, to reason, is precisely to instruct our motor systems in order to get us to behave in a more sophisticated and pointful way. So that's something I'll be talking about a lot more in this lecture. Just one point about the structure of files I was talking about and these essential indexicals. The essential indexicals feature in conceptual thought, all right, in the way I just gestured at. We might need to do all kinds of conscious deliberative reasoning in order to figure out that this is the occasion to act in pursuit of our desires. But even so, the indexical elements play no lasting role in the structure of files. There's no sense in which an indexical referring term can serve as a file to accumulate information. I've got this term, that book here now, and now that referring item is going to accumulate information. That makes no sense, because that book here now will refer to a different item on a different occasion of use, and so there's no lasting referent to accumulate information about. We need name-like files to accumulate information. Indexical referring terms are no good for that. Nor even will indexical referring terms play a lasting role in other concepts files. I might have a naming necessity file, lots of information about naming necessity. Believe me, I've got a lot of information about naming a necessity. And you might want to think that for a moment in that file is the thought, and naming necessity is here now. And that might instruct my action. But we won't keep that thought in the naming necessity file. Naming necessity is here now, because it won't be here now next time. Next time I use here now, naming necessity is unlikely to be there. So these essential indexicals kind of might make a temporary appearance in our permanent files that refer to things, but they don't stay there. Okay, I now want to broaden out the picture. The things I've just been talking about will still be relevant to what I'm talking about today, but I want to broaden things out. And I want to talk about reference and representation generally. So I've been assuming, along with many of the people I've been discussing, that mental files concepts refer to objects. But you might wonder, well, how so? What's the mechanism? What's the metasemantics in virtue of which we have a file, we open a file when we start thinking about something, and we take it refers to the object. Okay, traditionally, it was thought, people who thought of concepts as Phrygian modes of presentation, that the information attached to the concept would refer in virtue of uniquely picking out the referent, description theories of reference. I take it that we're not assuming that anymore. I can have a file, I open it for some object, I meet a cup, and then I'm referring to that item, accumulating information out of it, but I may well not have any kind of uniquely identifying information about it. You might think I've got to be able to track it, I've got to be able to re-identify it. I'm not sure. I think it's at first pass enough that I meet the cup, I open the file, I refer to it. You might say, given what I'm saying now, well, shouldn't we just think of the encounter with some object, some person, some physical object, some substance generally, some biological species, that the object you encounter when you open the file thereby becomes the reference. That the file always refers to the thing that triggered its opening. I don't mind that idea too much. I mean, it's pretty close to the truth, but we'll see at the end it's not quite the truth. And what's more, we need an explanation, which I haven't given at all yet, of why it is that certain mental items refer to what they do. And when we have that explanation, we'll see it's by no means guaranteed, though it is normal, that files will refer to the object that triggered their opening. To understand reference, we need to understand representation more generally. Reference for concepts, reference for names, reference for single words depends on the truth conditional content of whole thoughts. Frege's context principle. Only in the context of satsa do words have meaning. We need to think of the reference of words as their contribution to the truth conditions of whole sentences. It can kind of seem puzzling. I mean, thoughts are composed of concepts, sentences are composed of words, so there's a sense in which the truth condition, the content of the whole thought, the whole sentence, depends on the referential contributions of the words. The referential contributions of words just are the contribution they make to the whole truth condition. So in the order of construction of thoughts, kind of the parts come first and the whole is determined by the parts. But from the metasemantic perspective, this perspective of metaphysical dependence, we need to start with the truth conditions, the referential content of whole thoughts. And we need to understand what it is for the components of thoughts to refer to what they do in terms of the kind of contribution they systematically make to the whole thoughts that they contribute to. So what I'm going to try and do in this lecture is give you an account of what it is for a whole thought to represent as it does, to have the truth condition as it does, appealing to telesemantic ideas associated mainly with Ruth Millikan. And I want to try and use that to explain, in virtue of what particular files, particular concepts refer to what they do. Okay, so the issue for now is theory of representation. In virtue of what do thoughts represent what they do? This is a kind of late 20th century problem. It's kind of puzzling that people never used to worry about this in history of philosophy, not in the way we now do. And I think about why that's so. I'm not a big issue. But I guess a dominant thought until the middle of the last century was that the conscious goings on inside our head fix what our thoughts are about. I mean, just reflect on your thoughts. Can't you see what they're about? Isn't that kind of built into the nature of the thoughts, the introspective nature of the thoughts, that they make the claims about the world that they do? I mean, I'm not sure how much sense that thought makes, but it was a kind of thought that largely went without examination, largely went without saying. Somehow, externalism, materialism, middle of last century, we started thinking about things from the outside, as it were. I mean, here are organisms, they have goings on inside their head, and now there's a puzzle about what it is that makes those goings on inside their head represent things outside their head. How to approach this issue? Well, a natural thought is to start asking, well, what's the explanatory significance of representation? Here we have states of organisms, states of people, and we want to think of these states as having truth conditions. And a good question to ask is, what's the explanatory significance of this possession of truth conditions? What happens in the world in virtue of thoughts, representations more generally, having truth conditions? I mean, even that was kind of quite a hard question to get into focus. If you think of the launch of cognitive science, Fodor and Chomsky, Fodor's solipsism, he thought, right, I'm going to give you a story about the explanatory significance of representations. It's all to do with causal interactions inside the head. but became clear after a while that that might tell you about the explanatory significance of representations, but it's not telling you about the explanatory significance of representation. That story doesn't seem to invoke the fact that these things inside the head represent circumstances outside the head. It's to do with the way these things inside the head causally interact, and as far as the story goes, it's not clear that the fact they represent things outside the head makes any difference to that story. Once this issue came into focus, the first thing people probably thought was, well, to ascribe a content, a truth condition, a circumstance in the world as the representational content of some thought is perhaps just to specify which circumstances in the world will give rise to that thought. Is to kind of allude to the typical causes of the thought. But that's not a very good answer. I mean, for a start, it's too promiscuous. Thoughts are often caused by things other than their truth conditions. Sadly, unfortunately, human beings and other organisms often subject to false thoughts. Just talking about the circumstances that cause their thoughts doesn't really seem to point us to the thought's representational content. More specifically, we surely need a story that's going to tell us about representational content in a way that will make the difference between true and false thoughts matter to what happens in the world. This idea that there are certain circumstances that cause you to have thoughts doesn't seem to trade on the significance of truth conditional content, doesn't seem to bring in the fact that it matters whether a thought is true or not. I think the way to get around this is to, first pass, bring in a rather unpromising and old-fashioned idea. If we want to understand the representational significance of a thought, or think of it as a neural state in the head, we need to think about how the subject interprets that thought. What the subject makes of the thought. Now, of course, when I say that first pass, it sounds regressive. You don't want to have the subjects thinking another thought, interpreting the first thought. That's not going to get us anywhere. But think of the subjects interpreting the thought in terms not of further thoughts, but in terms of action. And then we can find the key we want. The most clear illustration is where we have not internal thoughts, but external signals. Famous example of Seyfarth and Cheney's monkeys, the vervet monkeys. They've got three signals, they shout out, well, I'll say it in English, but they shout out eagle, or snake, or leopard. And as far as what causes the state, eagles are not a very good story about what causes the state. The monkeys are quite sensibly prone to raise an alarm pretty readily. So certain kinds of dark clouds, aeroplanes, all kinds of things in the sky will make them shout out eagle. What shows that the representation means eagle is not what gives rise to the state, but what the monkeys then do. They run into the bushes. And that's a sensible thing to do just in case there's an eagle around. So you can see by their behavior, they're interpreting the signal as representing that there's an eagle there. Move it inside the head. I have some state that, let's take it, represents that there's a cube in front of me. Might be caused by lots of things other than cubes. All kinds of holograms, tromboid illusions might make me get into that state. What shows it it's representing a cube is what it makes me do. It makes me reach out and grab in a certain way. And what I do will work just in case there's a cube there. So I'm interpreting the mental state, the mental signal, as signifying a cube in the sense that I behave in a way that's appropriate to a cube being there. You can summarize these thoughts by saying that the condition represented by a mental state is the condition under which the actions which respond to the state will succeed. The subject is taking this state as proxy for some external circumstance, in the sense that it's behaving in a way that's appropriate, that will succeed, just in case the external circumstance is thus and so. And that's the basic idea of representation, if you ask me. I mean, note how now we can see what explanatory work notions of truth conditional content do. Now we can see that there's some further patterns in the world, certain processes that happen because of truth conditional content. It's not just things going on inside the head, various internal states interacting and perhaps generating some behavior. I mean, there is that. That's what the narrow cognitive science does for us. It tells us how internal states will lead agents to behave. But once you bring in representation, as well as representations, we can explain something else. We can explain not just that the agent will behave in a certain way, but they will succeed in achieving some result. Escaping the eagles, grabbing the cube. Not in every case where the behavior is prompted. When there's no eagle there, it's just an aeroplane running into the bushes is a waste of time. When I'm fooled, I might grab through nothing. Not in every case is the success achieved. But it's achieved precisely in those cases where the mental state was true. So think of it like this. The mental state prompts some behavior, and then if it's true, there'll be a truth condition in the world, and the truth condition together with the behavior will give rise to success. So that's the basic structure of representation. And what it shows that representation does give us explanatory power. People worry about the causal efficacy of content. The truth is, it's not the content per se that's causally efficacious, but the truth condition when it obtains that combines with the behavior to produce success. You might think of the representational context as programming for that kind of explanation of success in terms of the fact that makes the belief true. Okay, that's a very broad church framework I've given you so far. It's going to be developed in lots of different ways. I myself am inclined to develop it in the framework of teleosemantics, i.e. think about success in terms of achievement of functions and think of functions in terms of histories of natural selection. I guess most philosophers who hear somebody say this don't like it. They don't like the idea that somehow the explanatory significance of truth conditional content should somehow hinge on long ago facts about natural selection. How can that old history matter to how the explanation goes now? I don't want to fight about that now. I'm happy to let that pass. The crucial idea is that truth is fuel for success. If there's some other way of explaining what it is for actions to have a purpose, to succeed in achieving some end, if you can give me some non-biological or perhaps just non-historical account of what counts as success, then I'm happy. We'll be on the same side. I mean, I regard the appeal to evolutionary histories as a detail relative to the general shape of success semantics. I want to talk about a more important challenge to this way of thinking about representation. And that's the challenge of explaining how it extends beyond the case of representations that inform basic actions. It's very easy when now we're down to the level of the motor system and you've got me grabbing a cube or the monkeys running into the bushes So you can see, right, that's what it is for me to represent a cube at the point where I'm acting, or for the monkeys to represent an imminent eagle. But humans, and maybe lots of other organisms, represent all kinds of things beyond the conditions for successful action. I mean, we represent things in chemistry and astronomy, we represent things in history, we represent fairly abstract things, political systems, musical compositions. How is this story about representation going to apply there? I mean, the challenge is that teleological representations, success semantic representations, as I've described them so far, seem limited to representing affordances, occasions for action. People talk in this context of the Umwelt, the animal's Umwelt, the way the world appears to the organism from the point of view of action. And it's not clear how story of representation based in that kind of example is going to explain how we get to represent things beyond the immediate conditions of action. Mark Ortega has a nice way of developing this worry, more precise. So push me, pull yous. They're, well, not real, obviously, from British children's stories, Dr. Dolittle. And Ruth Millikan adopted this term for representations that are somehow tied to prompting behavior. So you might think of the monkey's eagle cry as simultaneously having an indicative content, there's an eagle around, and an imperative content, get in the bushes. Or you might think of my cube representations having an indicative content, there's a cube there, an imperative content, hold your hand so. And there's a quite close connection between the visual representations and the motor signals that are appropriate to grabbing things seen by the visual system. And so Mark says, well, isn't that going to be the case for all teleosemantic accounts of representation? You only get representations that have an imperative side as well as a descriptive side. But, and this is the challenge, surely that's wrong. Surely humans, and arguably many other animals, have representations that are purely indicative. They just describe how things are. They aren't telling you what to do. When I tell you that helium atoms have 2 electrons, or Cleopatra was ruler of Egypt, what's the action that I'm signaling? None at all. I have there representations we might call decoupled, representations that have no connection with any specific behaviors. No behaviors that are tied to those representations. And Ortega's challenge is how can we account for decoupled representations in the success semantic, teleosemantic framework? There's some literature on this. Kim Sterelny, Peter Godfrey Smith, my colleague Matteo Mamelli have tried various ideas. One idea is that a given state might prompt different behaviors given extra ancillary information. The monkeys, when they see an eagle far away, I think there's a modulation of the signal that says eagle far away, then they kind of edge towards the bushes, they don't run into them. When the eagle's very close, they do something different. So now you've got different behaviors. There's the eagle signal, and then there's some extra information that's far away, and they'll do different things. You might think the eagle behavior doesn't have any behavior of its own. But it's not that really does it. You might say, well, look, there's one signal, eagle far away, it's got one behavior, another signal, eagle close up, it's got a different behavior. You might try bringing in, well, perhaps the state will prompt different behaviors given different motivational states. I see a cube and I might reach out if I want to grab it. I might point to it if I want to show you an example of a cube. I might shuffle it around if I'm trying to build some Lego building block kind of thing. But still, you might say, well, that's not really detaching the signal from the behavior. This is a cube signal, and it's saying, if you want to grab it, do this. If you want to build a tower, do this. It's a disjunctive, a rather more complicated imperative, but it's still an imperative. I think the way to make progress here is to think about the decomposition of representational systems. So here I'm following Karen Neander. So Robert Cummins came up with a paper in 1975, Functional Analysis, and we etiologists about whatever, function is a matter of evolutionary history, functional representations matter of evolution. We hated Cummins. We thought he was just missing the point. He's got all this complicated machinery with parts playing their different roles, but those aren't really functions. They don't explain why the items that are there are as they are. But Karen Neander picked up Cummins and showed us that he has a lot to offer teleosemanticists. So the Cummins idea, let's put it in terms of functions, and not worry too much about whether they're etiological functions or Cummins functions, is that you can have a system, maybe an organism, and you can break it down into subsystems, and you can break those down into subsystems, and each part, each component in this decomposition will have its own special function, its own proximal function. So organism, humans, and they have a digestive system and a cardiovascular system. Cardiovascular system has various parts. It has the heart, the lungs, the blood vessels. And right, the cardiovascular system's job is to oxygenate the tissues and remove waste products. Break that down. The heart, its function, its job is to circulate the blood. You can see this. I mean, suppose the cardiovascular system isn't oxygenating the blood. Does that mean the heart isn't doing its job? Well, the heart might be doing its job just fine, but the lungs mightn't be doing their job. So the heart's job isn't to oxygenate the blood, it's to pump the blood. The lungs' job is to get the oxygen into the blood, and together they're going to do that, right? So there's parts, and each part has its own specific function. Now, Neander, having shown us this, then made a horrible mess of things, if you ask me, and she ended up deciding that the function of representations was always to represent something proximal, or at least perceptual representations, and not in the external environment. But I don't think that follows from the points that we've addressed so far. We can think of representational aspects of cognition themselves in the Cummins way. In fact, we've already had that in the examples I've given you. I didn't put it in these terms. Millikan says that when you have the monkeys and their signals, or the visual system and the form of objects, you have a consumer, the motor system, I'm going to reach out, or the monkeys who hear and are going to respond, and you have a producer, the system that is producing the representation. So the producer in the vision case is the visual system, the producing a representation in 3-dimensional or 2.5-dimensional form, and the consumer is the motor system, which then takes that representation and acts appropriately. That basic setup has a component that produces representations and a component that consumes representations. The job of the producer is to produce a representation when a certain circumstance obtains, is to produce true representations. It's not its fault if the consumer then messes up, my hand's not working properly, the producer's done its job. Okay, nice point is that in some cases we can have consumers of representations whose job is itself to produce representations. So I had a producer and a consumer. The consumer's job was to grab things. But now I'm going to change. I'm going to have a producer that's producing representations, and it's going to be consumed by a consumer that produces more representations. I mean, in fact, we can think about the vision case. It's already there in early vision. We have, within the system that's producing representations of 2.5D form, they're subsystems. They're edge detectors. They're edge detectors that, first of all, try and figure out where these discontinuities in luminosity and chromaticity are, and figure out where the edges of objects are. And they've done their job if they say there's an edge where there is an edge. And then their production of edge representations will be consumed by the further system, whose job is to, and perhaps using other information about stereopsis and so on, to produce the 2.5-dimensional form of physical objects. And then the 2.5-dimensional form of physical objects, that will represent what it does because it's going to be consumed eventually by the motor system. So now we have a system of lots of components. And we could imagine, well, we can think about it, but many components in our representational system involving all kinds of inferences. Each part has its own proximal job to represent some feature of the world. I mean, the whole process will eventually cash out in motor instructions. That's the point of the whole process. And the purpose of the earlier stages is to contribute to the success of the motor actions. But still, the components have representational functions of their own. Now this means, I mean, it makes perfectly good sense to suppose that in humans and other organisms, they're systems whose job is to explore and inquire, not in order to feed into any particular action sequence, action plan, but just to get information against the day it might become useful. You put a rat or similar animals in a new environment, they'll scurry around, just checking out where everything is. Not in order to immediately start acting, but just to store up this information. I mean, humans do that to the nth degree. They spend a lot of time thinking about philosophy and science and so on, not because any particular action is going to be informed by this, but just because this kind of information might come in useful one day. In fact, I mean, humans have probably got a derivative desire to pursue this kind of curiosity, even in cases where it's clear it's never going to make any difference to action. But that's a side point. And now I think we can see why we get decoupled representations. There's no sense in which the representations coming out of these exploratory, abstract inquiring systems are tied to any behaviors. I mean, you could imagine a great big disjunction, but that's got silly now. It's open-ended what desires are going to be informed by this information and what actions are going to follow. Now, to tie it back to things I said in the first two lectures, we might expect this kind of open-ended exploration and inquiry to focus on substances, the kinds of things for which we open files. Persisting objects, organisms, species, chemical substances, any of the objects which are loci of rich bodies of information which can be smoothly and efficiently stored in the kind of files we were talking about in the first two lectures. So exploration is going to lead to exploration inquiry, organisms just running around trying to identify substances, entities in which properties cluster, and opening name-like files to store that information. Okay, so we might seem to have got back to where we started. You might wonder what was the point of that long detour back to the starting point. Looks like we have subjects, organisms, other subjects, humans, other subjects, have files for substances, and those files refer to the item that prompted their launch. Items that, in which properties will cluster and in which can be usefully referred to by files. But now I want to show you that that's not quite right. And I want to give substance to the point I made at the beginning, that files will normally, but not always, refer to the substance prompting the file's launch. Before I make this point, let me make a different point. I wasn't clear about this until last week, but I was talking to François before my lecture then. And there's a sense in which origins are essential to files. But that's not a semantic notion, that's a constitutive notion. So the idea is I have a word, a name in the language of thought. I wanted to say at the beginning, think of these as persisting objects. They're items that, like a lectern or a cup that exists through time and to which the thought is items of information get attached. And qua persisting objects, I want to say, their origin is essential to them. If you imagine an object with a different origin, it ain't the same object. I'll say more about essential properties and why origins of persisting objects are essential to them in my lecture next week. But I want to hold that this is persisting object and it goes on through time, and lots of things can change, but one thing that can't change, so to speak, obviously can't change in time, but it can't change in modal space either, is its origin. So the origin of a file is essential to that file. So origins are essential to the file, but naming the object that was there at the origin, the thing in the world that prompted the launch of the file, naming that object is not essential to the file. A file can at one time name an object and then cease to name it later on. Famous examples, Madagascar cases. Files can switch reference during their life. The Madagascar case, Gareth Esden's famous example, in response to Kripke's causal theory of names. Talk about Kripke next week. I could have been talking about him today, but Evan's example is that apparently the name Madagascar originally referred to where are we going? I've got a picture of Madagascar here, but that's Evan's example was that the name Madagascar originally referred to that bit of Africa over there, and then somehow, through travellers' tales, the European public got muddled up and started using it to refer to the island. And I want to say that's perfectly possible. You can have a file, it's launched, initially as a result of being in contact with some object. Maybe for a while the file refers to that object, but then after a while it comes to refer to a different object. And to explain how that works, we need the kind of representation that I've been outlining. So remember, what a state represents is the circumstance in which the consumption of that state by downstream processes will be successful. Now, when we do telesematics, we normally think of the purpose of the consumers as being given, and the producers are then selected to serve them. Frog shoots out its tongue, its aim is to catch a fly. I reach out, my aim is to grab the object in front of me. And then we get the producers, the visual system, trying to be good at detecting the circumstance in which the behavior is going to work. But you could think of it the other way around. You could think, here these producers, we've evolved to have, as it were, open-ended, freestanding producers, just producing indicative representations. And now the consumers come along and figure out what's a good way of responding to these producers. And the result will be the same. We'll end up a system where the producers and the consumers are adapted to each other. Now, when we think of it that way, the consumers coming along and adapting themselves to the producers, by and large, they'll want to adapt themselves to the circumstance in which the object that was the origin of the file is present. I mean, after all, the properties in the file, the properties ascribed to the referent, it will generally be that object that has those properties. But not always. So, sometimes, as in the Madagascar case, you find people, the general linguistic community, is using the term not in the original way. And at that point, it becomes sensible for the consumers, the people hearing information about Madagascar, to act in a way that will work if the island has those properties, not in a way if that bit of the mainland has the property. Because after all, given the way the linguistic community is now working, that's the thing that's likely to have the properties in the file. We can do it in a more basic case. I mean, suppose a dog comes to recognize somebody new, opens a file first time, my brother say, and then after a while my brother's not around and I'm there and the dog uses the same file because it had the same origin, to accumulate information about me. Well, clearly the dog will do better to act in ways that will be successful if I have the properties in the file, because I'm the person who's normally going to have those properties. So, in these fine cases, in these Madagascar cases, we can see that reference does not automatically depend on origin. In most cases it will depend on origin, but not automatically. What it really depends on are truth conditions, and truth conditions are the conditions under which a consumption of a representation will be successful. And I'm going to stop. I've got to the end this time.
Thanks, David. You suggested when we discussed before the lecture that I would disagree with some of the things you would have to say today. I don't know what you had in mind, but anyway, that's not my question. So what do you do with Evanson's suggestions about the dominant source of information in the file, being what determines what the file is about? Do you accept that as part of the success semantic picture that you presented?
That's I think the corollary of what I said. It's if the consumer is going to adapt itself to what the producer is doing. I mean, what the producer is doing doesn't really have a content in abstraction from the way it's going to be consumed, but we can still think of the consumer kind of doing its stuff first, and then consumers coming along and trying to figure out, or adapt themselves what to make of this signal that's coming out of the producer. And the most functional thing for the consumer to do is to treat the content as about the dominant source of information. Because, so to speak, that's the way for the consumer to have as many true beliefs as possible and to succeed as often as possible. Success, I mean, it will need to also be geared to what the referent is. But yes, I mean, the dominant source of information will be the right thing. There's an issue here which I haven't really thought through, which is to do with what's going on in the interim where the consumer is adapting itself to the way the producer is working. But maybe that's fine, because what's going on in, I mean, Madagascar originally refers to one place, as later on it refers to a different place. It's fuzzy in between. What's made the difference is that people have started responding to information differently. So yeah. Yeah.
Hi, David. Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. And I couldn't agree more than that representations serve an explanatory purpose. But however, for something to count as an explanation, intentions come into play, I think. Right? One favorite example is somebody is asking, "Where's Mary?" And you reply, "It's Monday." And obviously, the person asking the question knows it's Monday, but hasn't connected the fact that it's Monday to Mary's absence, and apparently is ignorant of the fact Mary doesn't work on Monday, right? So I think, although I entirely agree that you enter into explanations with your representation, there is a certain level in which you enter the intentional domain. So let me tie that into a more theoretical question, perhaps. Well, ever since discourse representation came onto the market in the 80s, we've been thinking about how contexts change, but I don't think I've ever seen a proper account of the fact that indexicals may, in fact, change their referent and sort of escape from the Kaplan ideology, where I is always interpreted by the speaker and you by the hearer, or whatever the orthodoxy is. And yet they don't appear in quotation. So let me probably remind you of the famous British children's poem, "If I were you and you were me, I had one and you were three." Right? And then it goes on about something rather more practical about who wears what trousers. But
okay.
It's not hard for us to understand that. And I have yet been at a loss to give a proper account of that kind of switch. And we colloquially so often say, "If I were you, I wouldn't go to that lecture." Or if I were you, I would do this or that.
Yeah,
right? We never have a problem with that. But which indexical theory accounts for that kind of reference switch?
I have a little view about that, but I know about these cases from Hans Kamp. I mean, he was... so I is supposed to be super rigid and so on, but... example I know is... you know, there's a dangerous armed burglar around, and... my daughter knocks on her grandmother's door, and grandmother opens it, and daughter says, "No, you should be more careful opening the door. I might have been the burglar." And right, I mean, she doesn't clearly mean that she, it's not metaphysically possible for her to be the burglar. She's a little girl, right? It's what she means is the person at the door, right? So in those cases, we standard thing, right? Don't read off the content of the thought from the content of the words used to express it. And in this case, the only way to interpret what thought is being expressed by the words is my daughter means the person at the door might have been the burglar, not she might have been the burglar. So that's that case. Explanation. I don't like explanation. I mean, it's often easier to convey what you say by talking about explanation. I should just have been talking about causation. I wanted to know what causal difference truth conditional content makes in the world. That's nice and meaty and objective. And then when it comes to explanation, there's all this pragmatic stuff, you know, tell the person the thing that they don't know, you don't have to fill in all the other stuff and so on. So my interest was really in what causal difference does representation make.
Okay, thank you very much for your paper. I wanted to ask you to what extent your story about decoupling rests on the primacy of serving the goals of an instrumental action as opposed to communicative action. And well, but then the question in the case of the monkeys, for example, you have a producer of the signal and you have a consumer of the signal, and in a way, is it the case for you, on your view, that the producer of the signal has to kind of decouple her own action, her own behavior, her own instrumental behavior, which is to protect herself, the agent self, in order to make another agent become able to benefit or act instrumentally in appropriate circumstances. So I was asking, the question is, is the decoupling story dependent on some kind of primacy of instrumental action over communicative action, or once you recognize maybe the dual nature of instrumental and communicative action, what does it do to your story about decoupling?
I don't have any very good answer. What I was thinking was that the instrumental actions were the only actions important, and the communication, I mean, it's not an ideal example from that, but that's just a bit of the machinery. It's no different from what's going on inside my head when the visual system informs my action. But of course, commutative acts are a special class of action of a rather difficult and complicated kind, and I don't have very much to say about that and how far intentions are crucial to the whole speech production system is, I don't want to talk about it, it's too difficult, it's too interesting. Yeah, but yeah, so the communication of information prior to instrumental action was supposed to be just mechanical. I mean, don't think of it as an action. Gregory?
Thank you. I have a question to see whether how I understand these things that you're saying. So you want to say that on the one hand we can do most of the work with name-like concepts. But you want to maintain that there are essential indexicals in some cases. These are tied to actions, right? But then I wonder, isn't it sufficient to have the name-like concepts even in action, given that, for instance, the especially important concept I in actions will be a name-like concept in your account. So why should we suppose that beyond the name-like concept I, sort of Millikan style name, there's no need to postulate here an indexical. Why should we suppose that there are, you know, essentially indexical instances of I, or another concept that is indexical and that is homonymous, maybe, I don't know, or how do these two things articulate? I didn't understand that.
So the name-like I file I have, which I do think is name-like. I think it's very odd to think that my I thoughts are indexical. They refer to different things on different occasions. Clearly they don't. They always refer to me, the persisting organism. But just to have I thoughts like that isn't going to serve for the purposes of action. We act at spatiotemporal locations. We act at a here and a now. And to know that David Papineau will start his lecture in the Collège de France at 2 o'clock on December the 2nd, that's not going to get me acting. This is basic Perry point, right? I'm only going to act when I know that I am in the Collège de France, I'm at that place now. And so I need this now thought. Me now, me here now, is located in a certain place to get acting. It's because we act at spatiotemporal points. And the persisting, the reference to persisting self does not relate us to spatiotemporal points in the right way for action. Yeah?
Sure, so that's the explanation.
Ah.
So if you have an account with names, I mean, we agree that's the datum that we want to explain. You recognize that
Right, but the essential indexicals are here and now. Now, what I'm not so clear about, and this was Adriana's question at the end last time, is that we need a here and a now term to get us acting, but we also need to connect it to I. Yet I is the name for this lasting, persisting object. And we need somehow this lasting, persisting object to be connected to the here now. And I think there's more to say there, and I just don't even know how to phrase the issue, but there's clearly more to say there. Alice has one last quick question. No?
If I'm still allowed to be quick.
Okay.
It's past 3 o'clock.
There.
Okay, if I'm allowed to take a second question. I was born and bred in dynamic semantics, if you want, right? So I took issue with the view that you seem to propagate that representations get started once you get a sentence presented to you, right? I don't think representations come out of the blue, but they are in all sorts of important and intricate ways tied to their past, if you want, of the past of our conversation, or your past, my past, whatever, shared past, whatever, they don't come out of the blue, right? So I hope you agree with that. And I think a lot of the work of dynamic semantics is exactly formally modeling how these dependencies work and interact, right?
Absolutely. My subject in these lectures has not really been the structure of language. And of course, language is rich with anaphora and so on. But it's a further question whether thoughts have that kind of anaphoric structure. I mean, it's not obvious to me they do. I mean, so that there's all the complications of how thoughts are expressed in language. I'm trying to get to the structure of thoughts. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We'll stop now. Thank you.